So we are on the downhill slide of things because if you look at the syllabus for this course, the post-spring break period, there was going to be a week where I was out of town. We were supposed to have guest lectures, work days, field trips. Because all of those things aren't happening, not too many lectures actually left. So I will probably post a video to take the place of our guest lecture that was actually focused on River Falls sustainability and what the city is doing for sustainability. I will try and find like a TED Talk or some lecture that kind of fills that gap that we're not getting of kind of local focus on sustainability and planning. So keep an eye out for that. It'll get posted into the lectures, but just this lecture and the wrap up. So we're almost done. You're almost done. So not too many more to have to deal with. But keep an eye on the quizzes and the projects and those things. And certainly, email me or call me or whatever with any questions you may have. But we are going to focus on building sustainable communities. So taking really a lot of the topics that we've been talking about all semester and kind of putting them hopefully into some cohesive whole that makes sense and brings us together into kind of the bigger picture of how all this stuff works to actually build, communities that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. So moving forward here, we have to think about the impacts of climate change. So we're seeing ecosystem changes. Places are getting drier, hotter. We're seeing increased fire and drought. So we're seeing more natural hazards, shifting plant and animal habitats. Some places are getting wetter as well. So even though we consider climate change to be making places drier and hotter, what we're also seeing is that rain patterns are shifting. So here in the upper Midwest, one of the things that we're dealing with is more intense rain events. So we're maybe not getting necessarily drier over the course of a year, but what we're seeing are fewer, more intense rainstorms. So we have to deal with more flooding and longer periods without rain, which certainly has an impact on agriculture, farming, those kinds of things. So ecosystem change is an enormous challenge that's facing our communities and something we're going to have to deal with. And not going to watch the video here, but if you are interested, you can see how the wine industry in particular is dealing with climate change. In some cases, it's actually opening up new opportunities for areas that weren't particularly suited for wine growing. Now they're becoming suitable for wine growing. Other places are changing the varieties of grapes that they grow to be more suited to drier, hotter climates, those kinds of things, and having to adjust the kinds of wines that they actually make. So we're already starting to see the impacts of climate change on, particularly that industry now. So we have issues of human health. So our extreme weather events, new disease vectors. This is, I swear I made this lecture well before coronavirus happened. So this is not, I didn't edit this in response to current events, but obviously we're seeing, an increase in unusual diseases coming out and their potential for spread. We're also seeing diseases like malaria, which are spread by mosquitoes. We're seeing those move farther north into what had been more temperate climates. So mosquitoes were able to survive in what had been too cool of environments for them to survive in. So we're seeing, malaria in new areas, things like that. So certainly changes in where we see diseases and what diseases we see. Worsening air quality is impacting human health. We're seeing more droughts for water resources, more floods, glacier and snow melt is going to affect water availability in places. So lots of issues with water as the climate is changing, sea level rise, changing weather patterns, food and agri production. All of these things are going to be affected by climate change and influenced by that. And we're going to have to adjust accordingly to these new situations and conditions that we find ourselves in. So what are we doing about this? Cities are working very hard to reduce their environmental footprint. So we're seeing really cities take a leadership role in environmental response. So rather than waiting for states and the nation to take these actions, cities are really leading the charge in terms of addressing climate change in the United States. Other countries have been more aggressive in their policies than the United States has as a whole, but across our country, cities are where most of the action for environmental action is taking place. So things like composting, so curbside composting is becoming more common in cities across the United States. So that food waste that would otherwise end up in landfills and generate a lot of methane when it decomposes, and methane, as you probably know, is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So keeping that out of landfills is good because it reduces the space needed for landfills. It also can be composted and turned into a really good garden additive. So cities are able to compost it and sell that product and make money on it, which is kind of nice, and it subsidizes, you know, the cost of collecting the compost, so it benefits the city financially and environmentally. Looking at building retrofits to increase efficiency, so you know, things like adding insulation, replacing windows, putting in more energy efficient appliances, those kinds of things all make buildings more efficient and more environmentally sustainable. Transit is huge. Making sure that people have an option to get around the city without driving their cars. So that's transit, that's you know, bike and pedestrian improvements. That's also microtransit in terms of things like bike sharing and scooters. I think I talked about this during transportation, right? That the scooter rentals in Portland actually led to a significant reduction in car ownership and people considering and car trips as people were willing to ride the scooters instead of taking their car on short trips throughout downtown. So those are all tools that cities are using to improve air quality, reduce congestion, all of those positives that come from getting cars off the road. Water conservation and really land use is a huge one, right? If we want to reduce the environmental footprint, we need to think about how our cities are developed and recognize the environmental, social, and economic impacts of sprawl. So as you know, the bigger our cities get, the more single-use sprawling zoning that we have, the more people have to drive, the more social effects that has as people spend more time in their cars, the more environmental impacts that has in terms of air quality, impervious surfaces leading to water quality issues, you know, all urban heat island effect as we're paving more land, taking down more trees, right? All of those environmental, social issues are huge. The economic challenges of all that sprawling infrastructure that has to be maintained. So if we really want to affect sustainability, we need to focus on land use and building our cities more compactly, more densely, and reducing sprawl. That's going to be the biggest change we can make to improve sustainability in our cities. Well, I've got transit on there twice. See, that's how important transit is. And I want you to think about some practices and policies, other things cities can do to improve sustainability. So that's one of the activities for this lecture is to make a list of practices that you see cities engaged in to improve sustainability and upload that to Canvas when you're done. So cities are taking the lead on climate change response. I'm not going to show the video here. I'll put the link into the module so you can click on it there. So that'll be one that I definitely want you to watch when you can, but I'm not going to take the time here to keep this a more moderate length video. Okay, so economic sustainability, as we've talked about throughout this course, and you've heard me rant in other classes as well, infrastructure costs are eating our city's lunch. The costs of maintaining our sprawling development patterns, the water, wastewater lines, roads, all of those things are enormously expensive. And so cities are putting more and more of their budgets simply to trying to maintain what they already have on top of trying to build new stuff. And the way our development typically works is that because developers are paying fees and putting in new infrastructure, new development brings in a bunch of money, and the city is using that money, the new money coming in, they're using that to pay for fixing up existing and older infrastructure, so that basically the cities are kind of always behind. So when the maintenance for the next thing comes up, they're dependent on new development to pay the bills. And if new development doesn't pan out or declines, as we're likely to see with this coronavirus situation, cities are going to get stuck holding the bag on these massive maintenance costs that they can no longer afford. And so this video here, again, talks about Douglas County, Wisconsin, and I don't know if anybody's from there, but just gives some information on really the costs of infrastructure decline, infrastructure maintenance, the cost not just to local governments, but also on private people as their cars are damaged, those kinds of things from roads falling apart, sorry. So again, I'll link that video in the module. Not gonna play it here for you. So an additional challenge isn't just infrastructure maintenance, but also pensions. Pensions are a huge threat, just in terms of what's owed to current and former employees. So we're looking at about $1.4 trillion in public pension, unfunded public pensions. So that's, again, another potential challenge for communities. A big chunk of their budget's going to go to pay for that sort of stuff, which every time money's spent one place, it can't be spent somewhere else. And so as we spend more money on pensions and infrastructure maintenance, that leaves less money for things like public safety, parks and recreation. All of those things that we want cities to provide for us are going to be much more difficult to do in the face of these economic challenges of pensions and infrastructure. And what oftentimes happens is cities tend to look for big solutions. And so we have this this one project's going to make all the difference. And so cities will kind of chase after these pipe dreams of if we can just get Amazon to come to our city, or we get this big retail development to happen, it's going to solve all of our problems. And so they put a lot of effort and work into kind of these magic bullet solutions instead of doing more small scale incremental projects that can make a more sustainable improvement over time, rather than just the one magic bullet solution that oftentimes doesn't pan out or doesn't have the expected results that the city is hoping for. So by looking at smaller incremental efforts, you build diversity. And as we've talked about, diversity fosters resilience. So you're not dependent on one thing. You have multiple income streams, you have multiple employers, multiple services, all of those things spread out across your economy rather than having all your eggs in one basket. So when we start thinking about infrastructure and big projects like this, there's some questions we can ask ourselves that will help determine, the impact this may have, and also get cities to think about the long-term affordability of different things and whether or not it's actually worth pursuing a particular project. So first thing to look at is, what is the total project cost? Oftentimes what happens is cities get into some of these projects and the costs just start to build, and you get to that point of, well, we've already invested this much, so we're just going to keep going with it, and we're going to continue to invest more and more. And so you can kind of get into this cycle of project expanse and spending more money over time, because you've already invested so much, you don't want to walk away from it. So you want to really think about costs and make sure you have a very accurate assessment and expectation of what costs are going to be before you move forward with a project. You want to think about long-term maintenance costs. Again, typically we're pretty short-sighted in our thinking. We don't think 30, 40 years down the line. Politicians especially are worried more about the next election cycle than they are 30, 40 years down the road. And so, but the infrastructure that we're building is going to, is basically expected to last forever, right? If you're building water lines and wastewater lines to people's homes, you're going to expect those homes to be occupied for 30, 40, 50 years or longer. And so we have to consider the cost of the infrastructure serving our development as an ongoing cost forever. So we really want to think about, how are we going to afford this 30 and 40 years down the road when stuff starts needing to be replaced and we need to do some major investments just to keep the infrastructure that we have working, and not even counting new stuff we're building. And how's the project going to be funded? Is it debt financed? If we're passing bonds to pay for infrastructure, are we expecting future revenue to cover the cost of these bonds? What we're seeing in many cities who've used bonds, which is basically a long-term debt financing tool, more and more city budgets are being spent on just repaying debt. So basically cities are paying now for projects that were put in 10, 15, 20 years ago, paying off those long-term bonds. And by the time they get the bonds paid off from the original project, it's time to replace or rebuild that project. So they're sort of constantly in this cycle of issuing bond debt to pay for stuff, and by the time they get the bonds paid off, they're issuing new bonds. So there's never a way out of that cycle. It's like credit card debt, right? If you just keep transferring your credit card debt from card to card, you're never actually paying the debt off. You're just paying, the same thing every month. So cities are in that same cycle, and it's really hard once you're in that cycle to get out of it. So cities need to think about how they're paying for things, where the revenue's coming from to pay for things, and ensuring that they're prepared for downturns and projects not panning out, and ensuring that they're not going into so much debt that if things don't work out, they're going to be in a bind in the future trying to pay that debt off. So you want to think, again, long-term, how will the project alter the tax base over the next 40 years? So is the investment that we're making actually going to improve our tax base and our revenue, increase revenue over time? Or is it going to be a detriment? As we talked about, different land uses have different returns on investment. So, low density single family residents can cost quite a bit more in services than they're actually paying in revenues. So we need to think about how we fund projects in that long-term thinking to ensure that we're going to collect enough revenue to pay for the investments that we need to. And, what is the evidence that the project will achieve its goals? Do we have, is the developer had success in similar projects in the community? Have we seen projects like this be viable and be successful in other communities? Do we have examples of this in our community that are similar, that have been successful? What are the patterns we're seeing to understand whether or not a particular investment is going to make sense? And can we achieve this incrementally? Can we do it in smaller chunks instead of doing something all at once or trying to make this massive investment in a huge project? Can we do it in bite-sized chunks over time, maybe paying for it with current funds rather than going into long-term debt to pay for it if we do it kind of bit at a time? So just like if you want to go on vacation, you can take the option of, well, I'm just going to put the whole vacation on my credit card and pay it off in the future. Or you can save, $100 a month and save up for a year and then go on that vacation and pay cash, right? So think about how we pay for things, and how we can budget for it more effectively is an important question to ask before moving forward. And think about how the resources being used to fund a project, if there's other investments that are needed in our community that may be more important. So if you're offering incentives to a retail developer to build a retail project, and on the other side of town there's people who don't have adequate housing, would you be better off investing that money into providing housing for people as opposed to subsidizing some retail developer? These are the questions that need to be asked. What are the priorities in our community, and how do we best meet those priorities? And this is where planning plays an important role. If a city puts together a good, well envisioned comprehensive plan, a plan that engages the public throughout the process, really does a good job of identifying community values and priorities, that planning document can help influence the decision the community makes in these situations. So the city can look to the plan, see what the priorities and concerns and issues are of the citizens, and invest appropriately to meet those concerns. So it makes the decision-making process easier for the elected officials because they have a foundation in public engagement through the plan, and it ensures that the community vision is driving development decisions as opposed to those decisions being made on an ad hoc basis or just being, whoever's standing in front of the politicians at that particular moment gets what they want, right? So we need to think more holistically about our approach and ensure that we're working towards the community vision. So who will benefit and who will be harmed by the project? So this example here is I-49. It's a highway project in Lafayette, Louisiana, and it's basically it's like the urban renewal that we've talked about that did so much harm in neighborhoods in the 50s and 60s. It's continuing today, and this I-49 project is designed to run through a neighborhood, improve congestion, make access easier through Lafayette on this interstate. But the people who want it, who are most supportive of it, are the Regional Chamber of Commerce, the economic developers in the city, because they see it as an opportunity to make life easier for businesses. And of course, the people who oppose it are the neighbors, the ones who are going to be most impacted by it. And so we need to think about, who is going to benefit, who's going to be harmed by our projects, and how do we balance those conflicting concerns. And those values are really hard to determine. You can make an argument either way, but again, that's where planning helps, because if you have a vision for your community and you have set priorities, these kinds of projects can fit within those priorities, and decisions can be made not in the heat of a moment when you have protesters and whatnot in your face, but in a more rational and calm situation. And one of the things that communities can use to help with these decisions is the community capital framework. So community capitals are basically other forms of capital beyond just money. So typically when we hear that term capital, we think finance and money, financial capital, which is one of them, but there are others. So built capital is things like infrastructure, buildings, the things that people have built to be part of their community, that's an asset. Natural capital is the environment, the environmental characteristics of a community, the natural features that are in that community. Things like here in River Falls, we have the Kinney River. That's a huge piece of natural capital that we have. So things like that. Cultural capital is kind of shared identity and history and culture of a place. So think of like, here in Wisconsin, right, the culture of Wisconsin is rooted in sort of rural farming, agriculture, the Green Bay Packers, right? All of those things are part of our cultural capital, the identity that we have as being from Wisconsin. Cheeseheads, right? Human capital is the capacity of the people who live in the community. So education, workforce skills, health, social cohesion, or not social cohesion, but health, education, skills, those kinds of things for the people. Social capital is about relationships and networks of people in a community. Political capital is the influence that a community has on the political process, either at the local level or state level. And financial capital is the money that's available in a community. So all of these different forms of capital are important when we think about sustainability and how healthy a community is. So community visioning is super important, and if you're going to build your community capitals, you need to have goals and a vision. So what planners do is they help communities identify their vision and the goals and the strategies to achieve that vision. So that's what your job will be as a community planner, is to work with the community to develop priorities, build support for initiatives, and move the ball forward towards that commonly identified vision. When you put in place long-term goals, it allows you to have a common language for discussing strategies and priorities, because if you have agreed upon goals as a community, then you can talk about how you get there. And if everyone's on the same page working towards that same goal, it makes the process of determining how to get there easier, because you know where you're going. And you do need public engagement and community decision-making to set these goals. If you want support for decisions, if you want support for investments, you need to have community buy-in, and that happens through public engagement. So residents and citizens need to be involved in the planning process from the beginning. You can't bring them in at the end and say, here's what we're doing, you know, support it or not. They need to be part of those decisions in what you're actually doing. Identifying the vision, setting the goals, setting priorities, all of that needs to happen with the public involved at every step of the way. You need to do an inventory. So you need to take stock of the different forms of capital that the community has. So, you know, what are examples of various forms of capital? So here in River Falls, in terms of cultural capital, there is a unique identity here in River Falls. We have, you know, strong churches. We have various festivals that help, you know, build community cohesion. We've got strong neighborhoods. We've got, you know, a hospital and health services available. So all of those things are assets that we have to, in terms of River Falls culturally. In terms of human capital, we have the university, which is providing education and workforce development for the community. We have a strong school district here that's building, you know, giving skills to the students. In terms of natural capital, obviously the Kinney River. There's an extensive park network here in River Falls, you know, nice trails connecting different things, playgrounds, those types of assets in the community. So those are examples of various forms of capital. So think about your own town and consider what forms of capital are available in your hometown and how those could be leveraged to achieve community goals. Then you want to start thinking about options. What are some strategies that can move the community forward towards our adopted vision? Once we have the idea of where we want to go, how do we get there? What are some actions we can take to achieve the goal? So here in River Falls, you know, because we recognize that the Kinney River is an asset, the city has gone through an extensive process developing the Kinney Corridor Plan, which lays out specific goals and strategies to protect the river. So we have very strict land use regulations and other policies to protect water quality in the Kinney River. One of the big goals from that process was to remove the dams. And so there's a process in place now to move towards dam removal in the next 5 to 10 years. So again, the vision is to protect and preserve the Kinney River, and the actions have been identified to achieve that goal. And you want to prioritize those strategies once you have them in place. So then you want to look at your impacts. So as we put together our strategies, we want to look at the potential impact they'll have, both positive and negatives. So, you know, if we remove the dams, the positive is that we'll have a free-flowing river. Negatives are that we're actually going to lose some hydrogeneration electric capacity, so we'll lose a little bit of green energy in the city that we'll have to make up. Not very much, but that is a negative, right? We're going to lose, it's gone. We're going to lose that generation capacity. Also may increase the potential for floods, because we won't have the storage capacity of those dams to manage floods. So there's certainly some potential negatives that come from dam removal on the Kinney, but the pros in terms of returning the free flow of the river, improving aquatic habitat for trout, and those things outweigh the negatives and make it a good project to pursue. And you want to look across the community capitals. So you see the example here of some questions to ask of how a particular proposed project would affect different capitals. So you're going to have to balance those, right? Projects that improve natural capital may have a significant economic cost, right? That removing the dams is going to be very expensive, and funding for that's going to have to come from somewhere. So we need to balance the benefits with the costs in other areas. And so those are, again, questions that need to be asked as part of the public engagement process. And there needs to be an educational component that goes along with that to build community support for different actions and ensure that the actions being taken, again, are supported by members of the community. And then you assess your options and you start to make a decision. So you're going to have conflict between your different forms of capital, as I just mentioned, right? There may be an economic benefit that comes at a pretty significant financial cost. So you need to think about how, what's the priority, what's the issue we're trying to achieve, and is it worth the costs in this area to make improvements in another area? So, a project may be great for the economy, but have a negative environmental impact. So, having a tire recycling facility come to River Falls would create, good jobs, but there's an enormous environmental impact that comes with that. So is that the kind of business we want to recruit and bring to River Falls? Probably not, because we have a high value on the environment and the natural features we have here. So, again, by having a defined vision and priorities, we can influence the decision-making process to reflect those values and priorities. And the hard part really is doing the work. Going through a planning process, oftentimes what happens is communities, a comprehensive plan can take a year or more to develop. And so what oftentimes happens is that cities will go through this extensive long-term planning process, get the plan done, adopt the plan, pat themselves on the back, and call it a day. And the plan gets put on a shelf and is promptly forgotten about. We met the state law requirement that we do a comprehensive plan and update it every 10 years, and now we don't have to think about it for another 10 years when we have to update it again. And so it's important with any planning effort to ensure that there is a process for implementation and that there is a process to supervise or monitor implementation, whether it's city staff that owns that, a citizen committee, the city council, planning and zoning commission, whatever entity is identified, there needs to be somebody responsible for monitoring implementation and ensuring that project goals are achieved. So that's a key part that many communities oftentimes overlook in developing these plans, is that they don't really have a process in place to make sure that they actually get implemented. So discussion, I'm going to post a discussion question after this lecture that I want y'all to hopefully post in and have kind of an ongoing discussion on the time you can. Which of the community capitals do you believe is the most important and why, right? So between political, social, human, cultural, natural, built, and financial capital, is there one that is a priority for you or that you think is most important? How would you evaluate a project based around this idea of community capitals, and how would you determine which ones to prioritize? So again, I'll post that discussion in Canvas, and hopefully we can have kind of an ongoing discussion about that over the next few weeks as y'all watch these lectures and get involved. So my particular interest, is to give away my bias, is social capital. It's what I did my dissertation research on. To me, social capital is fundamental. This idea of relationships and networks within a community is super important to achieving community goals, because if people don't have trust in one another or their leaders or elected officials, it can be really hard to accomplish goals. If you don't bring the community together to identify those common visions and priorities, it can be really hard to get anything done. And in today's society, what we're seeing is a decline in social capital. We're seeing a loss of institutions that foster social capital, things like churches, civic clubs like the Rotary and Lions Club, those kinds of groups. Even the Boy Scouts has lost membership over there were 7.6 million Boy Scouts in the 1970s. There's like 2.2 million today. They just declared bankruptcy. So all of these organizations that people used to be part of that helped to build social capital are declining, or gone in many cases. So, you know, the thing with these social and civic organizations, places like church, is that they bring different people together. And so you may be a Republican, somebody else may be a Democrat, and you may disagree on a lot of things, but you're members of the same church, you know each other, you're in a relationship with one another through your church. And so that political disagreement is less important than the relationship you have through your church membership. And so it's harder to demonize people that we know and have relationships with. It's easier to trust people that we have relationships with. And so when we lose these institutions that foster those relationships, social capital starts to decline, and we start to lose that cohesion that makes communities function. So this is one of those areas where government is a really poor actor to try and foster social capital. You know, the government's not going to make you go to church. Government's not going to make you join a civic organization or be part of your community. But one area where government does have a significant role in helping to foster social capital is through our built environment. We can create spaces that help to foster social capital. Building neighborhoods where it's easy and safe to walk around is going to contribute to neighbors getting to know one another, meet one another, spend time together, start to build relationships in their neighborhood. Creating downtowns where people want to spend time, again, creates opportunity for people to come together. Building cities where you're not spending an hour or 2 hours in your car, so you have more time at home to meet your neighbors and be involved in community activities, right? So all of these are opportunities where government policy can influence the development of social capital and contribute to that cohesion and relationships that matter so much. A few final thoughts. What do you think are the biggest threats in our communities? Obviously right now we're all thinking coronavirus is probably the biggest threat in our community, but longer term, what are some of the challenges? Maybe things like infrastructure costs and economic stability. Could be social cohesion, could be threats to the environment, right? There are lots of challenges our communities are facing. In lots of ways, like I said, communities are taking the lead in addressing these challenges, not waiting for state and national governments to act. Cities are taking ownership and stepping up to respond to potential threats in really proactive ways. So that's a positive thing. Oops. And how do we build consensus around vision? So how do we build consensus in our communities to move forward on these challenges? So that's it for this lecture. Again, I'll post a discussion where we can talk about some of this stuff online back and forth. But think about those things and respond to the discussion that's posted. Have a great day.